So, hello and welcome back yet again. We are back with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a book I am enjoying quite a bit. Not gonna lie, I am having a very good time with it, even if I don't think I like old Victor Frankenstein that much anymore. I mean, if you look at it, the monster, and we're going to put that in heavy air quotes, that he created didn't attack him, didn't do anything violent. It just repulsed him. And so what did he, as a responsible scientist, do? Ran away? um yeah, no, I don't think that's how science works. Maybe that is how science worked back in the 1800s, but I don't think running away was the responsible choice, even if you think what you created is terribly ugly, although you were referring to it as absolute perfection and beauty until it actually worked and started breathing. And then you collapse in faintness on your fainting couch for like months. What's the monster doing? Not that I don't think we should call it Frankenstein's monster. I think we should just call it Frankenstein's child who he doesn't like. Anyway, enough of me ranting about poor Frankenstein's creation. I wonder if it gives itself a name. Well, I guess we're going to find out, not tonight, because tonight we are going to read 2 more chapters that will be finishing up volume 1. So that is kind of cool. And I think volume 2, we're actually going to see things from the monster's point of view. So I'm looking forward to that. But that won't be until tomorrow. For now, it is time to see what old Victor is doing as he is on his way home, or at least that was his intention, just to go home, forget about that whole monster thing, forget about any responsibility that he has to his creation. He's going home. Yeah, I don't have a lot of sympathy for him, but maybe that will change as we jump back in to Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, finishing up volume 1, beginning with chapter 7. On my return, I found the following letter from my father. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you, but that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expect a happy and glad welcome to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs, and how shall I inflict pain on my long-absent son? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible tidings. William is dead. That sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay, Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your 2 brothers went to walk in Philippines. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered William and Ernst, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernst came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and after waited for a long time, but he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself and was exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 a.m, I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched out on the grass, livid, motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was earnest to see the corpse. At first I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted, and entering the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and clasping her hands, exclaimed, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling child." She fainted, and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature that she possessed from your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him at the present, although our exertions to discover him are unremitted, but they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually and accuses herself unjustly as the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy, but will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother. Alas, Victor, I now say thank God she did not live to witness the cruel, miserable death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but come with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alphonse Frankenstein, Geneva, May 12th. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded the joy I at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table, and I covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry, when he perceived me weep, "are we always to be unhappy? My dear friend, what has happened?" I motioned him to take up the letter, while I walked up and down the room in the extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," he said. "Your despair is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavored to say a few words of consolation. He could only express heartfelt sympathy. "Poor William," he said. "Dear lovely child, he now sleeps with his angel mother. Who that had seen him bright and joyous in his young beauty must but weep over his untimely loss. To die so miserably, to feel the murderer's grasp. How much more a murderer that could destroy such radiant innocence? Poor little fellow. The only consolation that we, his friends, have is to mourn and weep, but he is at rest. The pang is over. His sufferings are at an end forever. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a subject for pity. We must reserve that for his miserable survivors. Clerval spoke thusly as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude, but now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into the carriage and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends, but when I drew near my native town, I slacked my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through the scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. How altered everything might be during that time. One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have by degrees worked other alterations, which, although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared not advance. I dreaded 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I could not define them. I remained 2 days at Louisiane in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid. All around was calm and snowy mountains. The places of nature were not changed. By degrees, the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of the Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and the lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace or to mock my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparative happiness, and I think on them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country. Who but a native can tell the delight that I took in on beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake? Yet as I drew nearer to home, fear and grief again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomy. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron, a village at the distance of half a league from the city. The sky was serene, and I was unable to rest. I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plainpans. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might watch its progress. It advanced. The heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming along slowly in large drops, but the violence quickly increased. I quit my seat and I walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. It was echoed from Seilave, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzling my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, Everything seemed of a pitchy darkness until the eye recovered from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over that part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Bellerive and the village of Coppet. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched this tempest, so beautiful yet terrific, I moved on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clapped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, my dear angel, this is thy funeral, this is thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon who I had given life. Why was he here? Could he be, I shuddered, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean on a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. No, he was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of that fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me to be hanging amongst the rocks and nearly perpendicular to the ascent of Mount Salève, a hill that bounds Plainpans in the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now tried to forget. The whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the work of my own hands alive at my bedside, and its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since that night on which he had first received life, and this his first crime. Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch, whose delight in carnage and misery had led him to murder my brother. No one can conceive the anguish that I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent cold and wet in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy on scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being who I had cast amongst mankind and endowed with the will and power of affecting horror, such as the deed that he had now done, nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit loosed from the grave and forced to destroy everything that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was just to discover what I knew of the murderer, and caused instant pursuit to be made, but I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being who I myself had formed and endured with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time that I had dated my creation, and which would have given me an air of delirium to a tale that was so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a story to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence a search. And then, of what use would the pursuit be? Who could arrest such a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Saleve? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family and went to the library to wait for their usual hour of rising. 6 years had passed as a dream, but for one indelible trance, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved, venerable parent. He still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was a historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and it represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Her garb was realistic, and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted any pity. Below this was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed as I looked on it. While I was thus engaged, Ernst entered. He had heard me arrive, and he hastened to welcome me. He expressed a sorrowful delight at seeing me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," he said. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. You come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate, yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune, and your persuasions will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain, tormenting self-accusation. Poor William, he was our darling, our pride." Tears fell unrestrained from my brother's eyes. A sense of mortal agony crept over me. Before I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolated home, the reality came on me as a new and not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernst. I inquired more minutely concerning my father and her that I named as my cousin. "She most of all," said Ernst, "requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "Discovered?" I said. "Good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the wind or confine a mountain stream. I saw him. He was free last night." "I don't know what you mean," said my brother, in accents of wonder. "But to us, the discovery we have made completes our misery. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all of the evidence that is shown. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amenable and fond of our family, could suddenly become capable of so frightful and appalling of a crime?" "Justine? Poor, poor girl, is she accused? But wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one could believe it. Ernst." "No one did, at first. But several circumstances came out that have almost forced the conviction on us, and her own behavior has been so confused as to add evidence of facts. I fear that it leaves no doubt. She will be tried today, and you can hear everything." He related that, the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel that she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the miniature of my mother. which had been judged to be the temptation that had caused the murder. This servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to the magistrate, and upon their deposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion in a great measure by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I told him, "You're mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor, good Justine, is innocent." At that moment, my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his face, but he endeavored to welcome me cheerfully, and after we exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic but then that of the disaster, if Ernst had not said, "Oh God, Papa, Victor says that he knows who murdered poor William." "Unfortunately, we do as well," said my father. "For indeed I would have been forever ignorant. I would rather that than to have discovered so much depravity and ingratitude in one I valued." "My dear father," I said, "you are mistaken. Justine is innocent." "If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I hope, if she is innocent, that she will be acquitted." This calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward that would be strong enough to convict her. My tale was not to be announced publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness. Did anyone exist, indeed, except I, the creator, who would believe unless his senses convinced him about the existence of a living monument of presumption and ignorance which I loosed upon the world? Not long after, we were joined by Elizabeth. Time had altered her since I had last beheld her. It endowed her with a loveliness surpassing the beauty of her childhood. There was the same candor, the same vivacity, but it was allied to an expression more full of sensibility and intellect. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," she said, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she can be convicted of crime? I rely upon her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have lost not only that lovely darling boy, but this poor girl who I sincerely love. She will be torn away by even worse a fate. If she is condemned, I shall never know any more joy, but she will not. I'm sure she will not, and then I can be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William." "She is innocent, Elizabeth," I said, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind and generous you are," she said. "Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that has made me wretched, for I knew it was impossible, and to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly a manner has rendered me hopeless and despairing." Then she wept. "My dear niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, we may rely on the justice of our laws and the activity with which I shall prevent any shadow of partiality." And that is how chapter 7 ends. Still don't like Victor. I'm going to grab a drink and we will finish volume 1. All right, let's finish up this volume with chapter 8. We passed a few sad hours until 11 o'clock, when the trial was to commence, my father and the rest of the family being obliged to attend as witnesses. I accompanied them to the court. During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered a living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of my fellow beings, one a smiling babe full of innocent joy, and the other far more dreadfully murdered, with every aggravation of infamy that might make the murderer memorable. Justine was a girl of merit, and possessed qualities which promised to render her life happy. Now all of that was to be obliterated in an ignominious grave, and I was the cause? 1,000 times rather would I have confessed myself guilty of the crime ascribed to Justine, but I was not here when it was committed, and such a declaration would have been considered as the ravings of a madman, and would not have caused her to be thought of as innocent. The appearance of Justine was calm. She was dressed in mourning, and her countenance, always engaging, was rendered by the solemnity of her feelings exquisite, beautiful. Yet she appeared confident in innocence, and she did not tremble, although gazed and mocked by thousands for all the kindness which her beauty might otherwise have thought. It became obliterated in the minds of all the spectators by them imagining the enormity of her guilt. She was tranquil, yet her tranquility was evidently constrained, and as her confusion before had been, it was accepted as a proof of her guilt. She worked up her mind to an appearance of courage, but to no avail. When she entered the court, she threw her eyes round and quickly discovered where we were seated. A tear seemed to dim her eye when she saw us, but she quickly recovered, and a look of sorrowful affection seemed to attest to her guiltlessness. The trial began, and after the advocate against her had stated the charge, witnesses were called. Several strange things combined against her, which might have staggered anyone who did not have her proof of innocence as I did. She had been out the whole night on which the murder had happened, and towards the morning had been perceived by a market woman not far from the spot where the body of the murdered child had been found. The woman asked her what she was doing there, but she looked very strangely and only returned a confused, unintelligible answer. She returned to the house about 8 o'clock, and when one inquired where she had spent the night, she replied that she had been looking for the child, and asked earnestly if anything had been heard about him. When she was shown the body, she fell into hysterics and was kept to her bed for days. The picture was then produced, which the servant had found in her pocket, and when Elizabeth, in a faltering voice, proved that it was the same which an hour before the child had been missed she had put around his neck, a murmur of horror filled the court. Justine was then called on for her defense. As the trial proceeded, her countenance altered. Surprise, horror, misery were strongly expressed. Sometimes she struggled with tears, but when she was desired to plead, she collected her powers and spoke in an audible, though varying voice. "God knows," she said, "how entirely I am innocent, but I do not pretend that my protestation should acquit me. I rest my innocence on a plain and simple explanation of the facts which have been adjudged against me, and I hope the character I have always borne will incline my judges to a favorable interpretation where any circumstance appears suspicious." She then related that, by the permission of Elizabeth, she had passed the evening of the night of the murder at the house of her aunt in Shane, a village situated about a league away from Geneva. On her return, at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked her if she had seen anything of the child who was lost. She was alarmed by this account, and she passed several hours looking for him when the gates of Geneva were shut, and she was forced to remain several hours of the night in a barn belonging to a cottage, since she was unwilling to call up the inhabitants, to which she was well known. Most of the night she had spent here watching. Towards morning, she believed that she had slept for a few minutes, but steps disturbed her and she awoke. It was dawn, and she left the barn that she might again endeavor to find my brother. If she had gone near the spot where his body lay, it was without her knowledge. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a sleepless night and the fate of poor William was yet unknown. About the picture she could give no account. "I know," she said, "how heavily and fatally this one thing weighs against me, but I have no power of explaining it, and when I have expressed my utter ignorance, I am only left to conjecture concerning the probabilities by which it might have been put in my pocket. But here also I am checked. I believe I have no enemy on earth, and none surely which would have been so wicked as to destroy me wantonly. Did the murderer put it there? I know of no opportunity that would have afforded him doing so, or if I had, why should he have stolen the jewel and parted with it so soon? I commit my case to the justice of my judges, yet I see no room for hope. I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character, and if their testimony shall not outweigh my supposed guilt, I must be condemned, though I would pledge my salvation upon my innocence." Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime that they supposed her guilty of rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward. Elizabeth saw even this last resource, her excellent dispositions and irreproachable conduct, about to fail, when, although violently agitated, she asked permission to address the court. "I am," said Elizabeth, "the cousin of the unhappy child who was murdered, or rather his sister, for I was educated by and have lived with his parents ever since and even long before his birth. It may therefore be judged indecent upon me to come forward in this occasion, but when I see a fellow creature about to perish through the cowardice of her pretend friends, I wish to be allowed to speak, that I may say what I know of her character. I am well acquainted with the accused. I have lived in the same house with her, one time for 5 and another for nearly 2 years. During that period, she appeared to me the most amenable and benevolent of humans. She nursed Madame Frankenstein, my aunt, in her last illness with the greatest affection and care, and afterward she attended her own mother during a tedious illness in a manner that excited the admiration of all who knew her. After which she again lived in my uncle's house, where she was beloved by all the family. She was warmly attached to the child who is now dead, and acted towards him like a most affectionate mother. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence produced against her, I believe and rely on her perfect innocence. She had no temptation for any such action as to the bauble on which the chief proof is resting, for if she had desired it, I would have willingly given it to her. That's how much I value her." A murmur followed Elizabeth's simple, powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference and not by favor of poor Justine, upon whom public indignation was turned with renewed violence, charging her with the blackest ingratitude. Justine wept as Elizabeth spoke, but did not make any answer. My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the entire trial. I believed in Justine's innocence. I knew it. Could the demon who had, I did not doubt for a minute, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sporting have betrayed the innocent Justine to death? I could not sustain the horror. And when I perceived the popular voice and the faces of the judge had already condemned this unhappy victim, I left the court in my agony. The tortures of the accused could not equal mine. She at least was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore at my bosom and would not let loose their hold. I passed a night in wretchedness. In the morning, I went to the court, my lips and throat parched. I dared not ask the question, but I was known, and the officer guessed the cause of my visit. The ballots had been thrown, and they were all black. Justine was condemned. I cannot pretend to describe what I then felt. I had before experienced sensations of horror, and I have endeavored to bestow upon them adequate expression, but words cannot convey an idea of the heartfelt despair that I then endured. The person to whom I addressed myself added that Justine had already confessed. The evidence, he said, was hardly required in this case, but I'm glad of it, and indeed none of our judges like to condemn a criminal upon circumstantial evidence, even evidence so decisive. This was a strange and unexpected intelligence. What could it mean? Had my eyes deceived me, and was I really mad, as the whole world would believe me if I disclosed the object of my suspicion? I returned home, and Elizabeth eagerly demanded the results. "Cousin," I told her, "it is decided as you might have expected. All judges would rather that 10 innocent should suffer than one guilty escape, but she has confessed." This was a blow to poor Elizabeth, who had relied with firmness upon Justine's innocence. "Alas," she said, "how shall I ever again believe in human goodness? Justine, who I loved and esteemed as a sister, how could she have put on those smiles of innocence and betrayed? Her mild eyes seemed incapable of any guile, and yet she is murdered?" Soon after, we heard that the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished Elizabeth not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgments. "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall come with me, for I cannot go alone." This idea was a torture to me, but I could not refuse. We entered the gloomy prison chamber and beheld Justine sitting on some straw at the far end. Her hands were manacled, and her head was on her knees. She rose upon seeing us enter, and when we were left alone with her, she threw herself at the feet of Elizabeth, weeping bitterly. Elizabeth also wept. "Oh, Justine," she said, "why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was then wretched, I was not nearly as miserable as I am now." "Why do you also believe that I am so very, very wicked? Do you also join with my enemies to crush me and condemn me as a murderer?" Justine's voice was suffocated with sobbing. "Rise," said Elizabeth. Why do you kneel, if you are innocent? I am not one of your enemies. I believed you guiltless, notwithstanding the evidence, until I heard that you had declared your own guilt. That report you now say is false. But be assured, dear Justine, nothing could shake my confidence in you except for your own words. I did, said Justine, but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that lie lies heavier on my heart than any of my other sins. God of heaven, forgive me. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened and menaced till I almost began to think that I was the monster he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last minutes if I continued to say I was innocent. My dearest Elizabeth, I had no one to support me. Everyone looked upon me as a wretch doomed to ignominy. What else could I do? In an evil hour, I confessed to a lie, but now I am truly miserable. She paused, cried, and then continued. I thought with honor, sweet lady, that you should believe your Justine, who your aunt had so honored and who you had loved. I could not believe that you would believe I was capable of a crime that none but the devil himself could have done. Dear William, dear blessed child, I will see you soon again in heaven, where we shall be happy, and that at least consoles me, going as I am to suffer death. Oh, Justine, said Elizabeth, forgive me for having one moment not trusted you. Why did you confess? But do not mourn, do not fear. I will prove your innocence. I will melt the stony hearts of your enemy by my tears and prayers. You won't die. You, my companion, you will not perish on the scaffold. No, I could not survive such a misfortune. Justine then shook her head. I do not fear to die, she said. That is past. God raises my weakness and gives me the courage to endure. I leave such a sad, bitter world, and if you remember me, think upon me as one unjustly condemned. I am resigned to what waits for me. Learn from me, my dear lady, to submit in patience to the will of heaven. During this conversation, I had retired to the corner of the prison room where I could conceal the anguish that was possessing me. Despair. Who dare talked about that? The poor victim who tomorrow was to pass the boundary between life and death. She could not feel as I did this deep and bitter agony. I gnashed my teeth and I ground them together, uttering a groan that came from the soul. Justine stared. When she saw who it was, she approached me and said, Dear sir, you are very kind to visit me. You, I hope, do not believe I am guilty? I could not answer. No, Justine, said Elizabeth. He is more convinced of your innocence than I was, for even when he heard that you had confessed, he did not believe it. Then I truly thank him, said Justine. In these last moments, I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think upon me with kindness. How sweet is the affection of others to a wretch such as I! It removes more than half of my misfortune, and I feel as though I could die in peace, now that my innocence has been acknowledged by you, my dear lady, and your cousin. Thus, the poor girl tried to comfort others and herself. She indeed gained the resignation that she desired, but I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm in my bosom, which allowed no hope of consolation. Elizabeth also wept and was very unhappy, but hers also was the misery of the innocent, which like a cloud that passes over the morning, for a while hiding, but cannot tarnish its brightness. Anguish and despair had penetrated into the core of my heart. I bore a hell within me which nothing could extinguish. We stayed several hours with Justine, and it was with great difficulty that Elizabeth tore herself away. "I wish," she said, "that I were to die with you. I cannot live in this world of misery." Justine had assumed an air of cheerfulness, while she with difficulty repressed her own tears. She embraced Elizabeth and said in a voice of half-suppressed emotion, "Farewell, sweet lady. My dearest Elizabeth, my beloved and only friend, may heaven in its bounty bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune you ever suffer. Live, be happy, and make others happy as well." And the next day, Justine died. Elizabeth's heart-rending eloquence failed to move the justices from their settled conviction in the criminality of Justine. My passionate and indignant appeals were lost on them, and when I received their cold answers and heard the harsh, unfeeling reasoning of these men, my proposed avowal died on my lips. Thus, I might proclaim myself a madman, but not revoke the sentence that was passed upon my wretched victim. She died on the scaffold as a murderess. From the torture of my own heart, I turned to contemplate the deep grief of my Elizabeth. This also was my doing, and my father's woe, the desolation of that late so smiling home. This was all the work of my own hands. Ye weep, unhappy ones, but these are not your last tears. Again shall you rise the funeral wail, and the sound of your lamentations shall again and again be heard. Frankenstein, your son, your kinsman, your early much-loved friend, he who would spend every drop of his blood for your sakes, who has no thought or sense of joy except that it is mirrored upon your faces, who would fill the air with blessings and spend his life serving you, he bids you now to weep, to shed countless tears, happy beyond his hopes of this fate being satisfied, and if the destruction pauses before the peace of the grave, if it succeeds to your torment. This was the prophecy of my soul, as torn by remorse, horror, and despair. I looked upon those I loved spending vain sorrow upon the graves of William and Justine, the very first hapless victims to my unhallowed art. Thus ends Volume 1. Wow. All right. You could probably tell by the emphasis that I was putting on certain things that I have lost any trace of sympathy for Victor Frankenstein. He just granted she was a servant, so she was thus below him or whatever, but he just let her get killed by his own silence and cowardice. Oh, I do not like him at all. I mean, miscarriages of justice are probably very, very common, probably even more common back then when there were a lot of superstitions. But, I mean, we still don't know that it was actually the creature that killed the boy, William. But if you were pretty convinced that it was, and you created something, and 2 years have gone by and you think it killed your brother, you're just gonna sit there and not say a word as somebody else is accused and then convicted of this crime? Yeah, I hopefully we like the monster better, even if he did kill things. But yeah, I'm definitely liking the monster way better than the monster's creator. And we haven't even spent any time in the monster's head, so who knows? Anyway, as always, thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed the end of Volume 1 and are looking forward to Volume 2 tomorrow. Please do hit the thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile. Make sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss Volume 2 of Frankenstein, and I will see you tomorrow.